When Claire Bennett walked into Sebastian Kane's office for the first time, she had no idea that a simple handshake would change everything. He was blind, powerful, untouchable. But when his fingers brushed hers, something shifted. He tilted his head, almost confused, and said her name like he'd been waiting to hear it. What happens when a man who can't see becomes the only one who truly sees you? Hit that like button, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Ready to dive into today's chapter? Claire's heels clicked against the marble floor of Kane Industries' executive suite, each step echoing her racing heartbeat. She'd interviewed for countless assistant positions before, but none in a building this intimidating. All glass and steel, overlooking Manhattan like a kingdom. The receptionist barely glanced up, just pointed toward the double doors at the end of the hall. Claire smoothed her skirt, checked her reflection in the polished wall, and knocked. A deep voice called for her to come in, controlled and completely unbothered. She pushed the door open and stopped. Sebastian Kane stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, hands in his pockets, perfectly still. Tailored charcoal suit, dark hair just slightly too long, strong jawline. He looked like he belonged on a magazine cover, not trapped in an office. Except for his eyes, beautiful, dark but unseeing, fixed somewhere past her shoulder. Claire introduced herself, keeping her voice steady. He turned toward her with unsettling precision and told her to close the door. The click felt too loud in the quiet room. Then he told her to come closer. She crossed the office, her nerves climbing with each step. He didn't move, didn't reach out, just waited. When she was close enough, he extended his hand and said he could guess she was nervous. She admitted she was, a little, and took his hand. His grip was firm and warm, but instead of shaking and releasing, his thumb brushed across her knuckles. Once, twice, like he was reading something she didn't know she'd written. He told her she had steady hands, that it was good, that he needed someone who didn't flinch. Claire pulled her hand back gently, her pulse stumbling, and told him she didn't flinch. A small smile touched his mouth, barely there, but devastating. He said they'd see about that. He moved past her, navigating the office with casual confidence that made her forget, for a second, that he couldn't see. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk and told her to sit. She did. Sebastian settled into his own chair, leaning back like a man completely in control. He mentioned her resume, 3 years as an executive assistant, 2 tech startups that folded. He assumed it wasn't her fault. She confirmed it wasn't, adding a quiet sir at the end. He corrected her immediately. Sebastian, not sir. He didn't like formality when it was just the two of them, just us. The phrase landed heavier than it should have. He asked why she wanted the job. Claire had prepared for this question, practiced her answer in the mirror that morning. But sitting across from him, those rehearsed words felt wrong. He'd know. Somehow, she was certain he'd know. She told him honestly that she needed the stability and that she was good at what she did. He wouldn't find someone more organized or more committed. Sebastian repeated the word committed, testing it. He said that's what the last 3 assistants had told him too, and they'd all quit within 6 months. Claire asked why. He explained that he was demanding, didn't tolerate mistakes, and required a level of proximity that made people uncomfortable. The way he said proximity made her stomach flip. She told him she could handle demanding, and that she didn't get uncomfortable easily. Sebastian tilted his head, something unreadable crossing his face. He told her to stand up. Claire rose slowly. He stood too, moving around the desk until he was directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive, woody, masculine. He explained that he navigated the world through other senses, that he needed his assistant to understand that, to not be afraid of it. Before she could respond, he lifted his hand and stopped just inches from her face. He asked if he could touch her face, his voice quiet. Her breath caught. She should say no. This was an interview, not whatever this was becoming. But she said yes. His fingers touched her temple, feather-light. They traced down to her jaw, her chin. Not invasive, not inappropriate, just thoroughly, completely attentive. Like he was memorizing her. He murmured that she was taller than he expected, guessing 5'7". She corrected him, 5'8". His hand dropped. The job was hers if she wanted it, he said. 60 hours a week minimum, travel required. She'd be with him constantly. Meetings, dinners, events. Could she handle that? Claire's mind was still stuck on the ghost of his touch against her skin. She told him she could handle it. Good, he said, stepping back as a professional mask slid into place. She'd start Monday, 7 a.m. sharp. She confirmed she'd be there as she turned to leave. His voice stopped her at the door. He said her name, just Claire, and she looked back. He was facing her again, perfectly aligned despite the distance. He told her not to be late, that he didn't like waiting. The way he said it, low, almost intimate, sent heat crawling up her neck. She promised she wouldn't be late and left before he could see her blush, or before she remembered he couldn't see anything at all. Monday morning arrived too quickly. Claire stood outside Kane Industries at 6:45, coffee in hand, telling herself this was just another job, just another demanding boss. The fact that she'd replayed that interview in her head approximately 200 times meant nothing. She rode the elevator to the executive floor, her stomach doing small flips. The office was already buzzing, assistants prepping for the day, phones ringing, the hum of a billion-dollar company waking up. Sebastian's office door was open. He sat at his desk, headphones on, fingers moving across a braille display connected to his computer. Even sitting down, he had this presence, shoulders back, jaw set, completely focused. Claire knocked softly on the doorframe. He pulled off the headphones immediately and told her to come in, that she was early, that he liked that. She set her bag down and asked what he needed first. He leaned back in his chair, and for a second, she could have sworn he was looking right at her. He said they'd start with his calendar, then emails, then prep for a 9:30 with investors. But first, coffee. He asked if she'd figured out yet that he was particular about coffee. Claire admitted she hadn't, but she'd learn. He described exactly how he wanted it. Double espresso, specific temperature, no sugar. As she wrote it down, he added that his last assistant had gotten it wrong for 4 months straight and never bothered to ask. He said he had a feeling Claire wasn't like that. Something about the way he said it made her chest warm. The morning moved fast. Claire learned his systems, his preferences, the way he organized files by texture and sound. He never fumbled, never hesitated. Watching him work was like watching someone conduct an orchestra. Precise, controlled, almost beautiful. Around 11, he asked her to read through a contract. She pulled a chair next to his desk, and as she read aloud, he listened with his head tilted slightly toward her. At one point, he held up his hand to stop her, asking her to repeat a clause. She did, and he frowned, telling her to make a note that the terms were unacceptable. His hand was still raised between them. Without thinking, Claire's fingers brushed against his as she reached for her pen. He went very still. So did she. Neither of them moved for what felt like forever, but was probably only 3 seconds. Then Sebastian lowered his hand slowly and told her to continue reading, but his voice had changed, quieter, rougher around the edges. Claire tried to focus on the words in front of her, but all she could think about was that tiny moment of contact and the way her skin still felt warm where they'd touched. By late afternoon, Sebastian had back-to-back calls. Claire worked at the small desk in the corner of his office, organizing files, responding to emails on his behalf. She could hear his voice, confident, sharp when needed, persuasive when closing deals. It was attractive in a way that annoyed her. She was supposed to be professional. When the last call ended, he asked if she was still there. She told him she was. He said good, that he needed her to walk him through the investor presentations for tomorrow. She grabbed the files and returned to the chair beside his desk. As she described each slide, he asked questions, made adjustments, his mind clearly 3 steps ahead of everyone else. At one point, she stumbled over a word. He told her to slow down, that he wasn't going anywhere. The way he said it, patient, almost gentle, caught her off guard. She slowed down. When they finished, Sebastian stood and stretched. Claire tried very hard not to notice the way his shirt pulled across his shoulders. He asked if she had plans for dinner. Her brain short-circuited for a second before he clarified that he had a business dinner at 8, needed her there to handle details. Of course. Business. She told him she'd be ready. He moved toward the windows, hands in his pockets, and mentioned that she'd done well today, better than he'd expected. Most people took weeks to adjust to his pace. Claire stood, gathering her things, and said she didn't like wasting time. He smiled, a real one this time, not the controlled version from the interview. It changed his whole face, made him look younger, less untouchable. He told her the car would pick her up at 7:30, that the restaurant had a dress code, and that she should wear something nice. As she headed for the door, he added one more thing. He said her perfume was distracting, something with vanilla, and asked what it was. Claire's cheeks burned. She told him it was just something simple, that she could change it if it bothered him. "No," he said quickly, "don't change it." Then, softer, he admitted he liked it. She left before she could say something stupid. But all the way home, she couldn't stop replaying those last two words. The restaurant was the kind of place Claire had only seen in magazines. Dim lighting, white tablecloths, waiters who moved like ghosts. She'd chosen a simple black dress, nothing too fancy, but the way Sebastian's driver had looked at her when she got in the car made her wonder if simple was enough. Sebastian was already at the table when she arrived, and somehow he knew the exact moment she walked in. He stood, and the maitre d' guided her over. As she sat down across from him, he mentioned that she was right on time, that punctuality was underrated. She smoothed her napkin across her lap and asked if the investors had arrived yet. "Not yet," he said. "They had 10 minutes. He asked if she wanted wine." Before she could answer, he'd already signaled the sommelier and ordered something in flawless French. Claire tried not to be impressed and failed completely. When the wine came, Sebastian picked up his glass with perfect precision and said they should talk about something other than work for a few minutes. He wanted to know about her, where she grew up, what she did before the corporate world. Claire hesitated. She wasn't used to bosses who cared about anything beyond productivity. She told him she grew up in Boston, went to school for communications, moved to New York because it felt like the only place big enough for what she wanted. He asked what she wanted. She'd never really put it into words before. Security, she supposed, independence, a life that was hers. Sebastian took a slow sip of wine and said that sounded lonely. It caught her off guard. She told him maybe it was, sometimes. He set his glass down carefully and mentioned that he understood that. The loneliness of building something alone. Before the accident, he'd been so focused on success that he'd barely noticed how isolated he'd become. After he lost his sight, the isolation became impossible to ignore. Claire found herself leaning forward without meaning to. She asked if he ever regretted it, pushing so hard. "No," he said simply. Regret was useless, but he'd learned that success didn't mean much if there was no one to share it with. The moment hung between them, intimate and unexpected. Then the investors arrived, loud and oblivious, and the spell broke. The dinner itself was a performance. Claire watched Sebastian command the table without seeing a single face, reading the room through tone, through pauses, through the small shifts in energy that most people missed. He was brilliant, and he knew it, but every so often his hand would brush hers when reaching for his water glass. Or he'd lean slightly in her direction when she whispered a detail he'd requested. Small things. Probably accidents, except they didn't feel like accidents. When the investors finally left, Claire exhaled. Sebastian asked if she was tired. Exhausted, she admitted. He stood and extended his hand. She took it, letting him help her up, and his fingers lingered just a second too long before releasing her. The car ride back was quiet. Sebastian sat beside her in the back seat, closer than necessary in a car this size. She could feel the heat of him through the space between them. He asked if she thought the meeting went well. She told him it went perfectly, that he'd handled them like a chess master. He smiled in the darkness and said it helped having someone he could trust beside him. Then, quieter, he admitted that most of his assistants felt like strangers even after months. But with her, it was different. He wasn't sure why. Claire's heart did something complicated in her chest. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. When they pulled up to her building, Sebastian told the driver to wait. He said he'd walk her to the door. She started to protest, but he was already out of the car. She took his arm without being asked this time, guiding him up the 3 steps to her building's entrance. At the door, she thanked him for dinner. He told her she didn't need to thank him, that it was work, but it hadn't felt like work. Not entirely. Sebastian's hand found her wrist, his thumb pressing gently against her pulse. He asked if her heart always beat this fast. Only around you, she thought. But what she said was that it had been a long day. He didn't let go. Instead, he stepped closer, close enough that she could count his breaths if she wanted to. He told her to go inside, get some rest. They had an early flight tomorrow. Business trip to Boston, 2 days. Boston, she repeated, her brain catching up slowly. He said he'd cleared it with her already. Remembered asking that morning if she had any conflicts. She'd said no. She had said no. She'd forgotten. Or maybe her brain had just stopped working somewhere between the wine and the way his fingers felt against her skin. Sebastian released her wrist slowly, like he didn't really want to. He told her the car would pick her up at 5 a.m., that she should pack for cold weather. Then he walked back to the car without stumbling once, leaving Claire standing in her doorway, wondering what the hell was happening to her. Boston was colder than Claire remembered. The hotel Sebastian had booked was in Back Bay, all historic charm and modern luxury, the kind of place where even the lobby smelled expensive. They had adjoining rooms. Sebastian mentioned it casually during check-in, said it was easier for early meetings, for logistics. Claire told herself that made sense, told herself the flutter in her stomach was just nerves about being back in her hometown. The first day was packed with meetings, potential acquisitions, investor lunches, contract negotiations. Claire stayed close, feeding him information, watching him dismantle every objection with surgical precision. By 6 p.m., they were both exhausted. Back at the hotel, Sebastian knocked on the adjoining door and asked if she wanted to grab dinner. Somewhere quiet, he said. No business talk. They found a small Italian place 3 blocks away, the kind with checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles. Over pasta and red wine, he asked about her family. Claire told him they'd moved to Florida years ago, that she didn't visit often. Things were complicated. He asked if that bothered her, the distance. Sometimes, she admitted, but she'd learned early that wanting people to be different than they were only led to disappointment. Sebastian was quiet for a moment, then said that sounded like something someone had taught her to believe, not something that was true. The observation stung because it was accurate. Claire took a long sip of wine and changed the subject, asking why he'd never mentioned having family. He had a sister in London, he said. They talked once a month, mostly out of obligation. His parents had passed when he was in college. After the accident, his sister had wanted him to move in with her, let her take care of him. He'd refused. Claire asked why. Because pity felt worse than loneliness, he said simply, and he'd needed to prove he could still do it alone. She understood that more than she wanted to admit. Back at the hotel elevator, they stood close in the small space. Claire could feel the tension building again, that electric thing that had been growing between them for 2 weeks now. Sebastian asked if she was tired. Not really, she said. He suggested they have a drink in his room, mentioned the minibar, said he wasn't ready to call it a night yet. Every rational part of Claire's brain screamed that this was a bad idea, but she heard herself say, okay anyway. His room was identical to hers but felt different with him in it. He poured them both whiskey while she stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. He asked what she was thinking about. The truth was, she was thinking about how easy it would be to cross the room and kiss him. But what she said was that Boston looked different from up here, smaller than she remembered. Sebastian moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. He said people always looked smaller from a distance, that getting close changed everything. Claire's breath hitched. She turned to face him and found him already oriented toward her, like he'd known exactly where she'd be. He asked if she was happy working for him. The question surprised her. She told him yes, that it was challenging and demanding, and she was learning more than she had anywhere else. That wasn't what he was asking, he said. He wanted to know if she was happy. Claire didn't know how to answer that. Happy felt complicated when being around him made her feel things she definitely shouldn't feel for her boss. Sebastian set his glass down and told her he needed to say something, that he'd been trying not to, trying to keep things professional, but he was failing spectacularly. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He said he thought about her constantly, wondered what she was doing when she wasn't with him, looked forward to hearing her voice every morning, and he knew it was inappropriate, knew all the reasons it was a terrible idea, but he needed her to know. Claire's whole world narrowed to the space between them. She asked what he wanted her to do with that information. He said that was up to her, that if she wanted to pretend he'd never said anything, they could. He'd never bring it up again. But if she felt even a fraction of what he felt, she closed the distance and kissed him. For a second, he went completely still, like he couldn't believe it was happening. Then his hands found her face, cupping it gently, and he kissed her back like he'd been starving for it. The kiss lasted forever and no time at all. When they finally pulled apart, Claire's hands were fisted in Sebastian's sweater and his forehead rested against hers, both of them breathing hard. He asked if she was sure about this, his voice rough and low. She told him she'd never been more sure of anything. What happened next was slow and deliberate and absolutely everything Claire hadn't known she needed. Sebastian touched her like he was memorizing her, his hands mapping every curve, every inch of skin, learning her in the darkness that was his constant companion. There was no rushing, no fumbling, just heat and want, and the kind of intimacy that came from truly being seen by someone, even without sight. Later, they lay tangled together in his bed. Sebastian's fingers traced lazy patterns on her shoulder, and he asked if she was okay. "More than okay," she whispered. He pulled her closer and admitted he'd been terrified she'd say no, that she'd walk away, that she'd think he was just another boss taking advantage. Claire shifted to face him, even though he couldn't see her. She told him she'd never thought that, not once, that what she felt for him had nothing to do with work and everything to do with who he was when the world wasn't watching. He kissed her again, softer this time, and said he didn't want her to be his assistant anymore. Her stomach dropped. She started to pull away, but he held her there and explained. He wanted her as a partner, he said, in business and in everything else. He'd been building something new, a venture fund for accessibility technology, and he wanted her to run it with him. Equal partnership, equal stake. Claire couldn't breathe. She asked if he was serious. He told her he'd never been more serious about anything in his life. Then he added that she could say no, that he'd understand if it was too much too fast, but he had to ask. She said yes before he could finish the sentence. 3 months later, Claire stood in the office space they'd leased in Soho, watching movers bring in furniture. Sebastian navigated through the chaos like he owned it, because he did. They both did. He found her by the windows and asked what she was thinking. She told him she was thinking about that first day in his office, how terrified she'd been, how she'd had no idea her whole life was about to change. He smiled and said he'd known. The moment he'd touched her hand, something had shifted. He hadn't understood it then, but he did now. Claire asked how he'd known, because her hand had trembled, he said, but she hadn't pulled away, and that told him everything. She laughed and told him that was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her. He pulled her close and said he was just getting started. Then he kissed her, right there in their new office, with movers working around them and sunlight streaming through the windows. When they broke apart, Claire rested her head against his chest and thought about how strange life was. She'd taken a job as an assistant and found a partner. She'd expected loneliness and found home. Sebastian asked if she was happy. This time she knew exactly how to answer. She told him she was completely, ridiculously, impossibly happy. He said good because he had one more question. She tensed, suddenly nervous. He asked if she'd have dinner with him that night, somewhere quiet, just the two of them. No business talk, no interruptions, just them. Claire smiled against his shirt and told him she'd follow him anywhere. And she meant it. So, what did you think? Rate this story from 1 to 10 in the comments. We'd love to know. Thank you so much for being here and letting us share Claire and Sebastian's journey with you. Your time means everything to us. A new chapter is coming soon. Don't miss it. Bye-bye.